Welcome back, everyone. Another episode, another great conversation. This time, we were in I was in Egypt. It was great, man. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Maha Bali, professor at the American University in Cairo. Say again, what's up?
Finals week. That was what was up.
That's what was up.
I'm still recovering. Hey, like I tell my friends, war is over. Got a very interesting summer lined up.
Yeah, I mean, people don't know this, but this is the second take of this because apparently finals week means that my producer forgot to hit the record button, so we're doing this again. It'll be just as good as the first one. But I'm excited about this. You know, I remember at the beginning of the season, you talked about going global, and you know, I kind of laughed at you, but like this really felt that way, right? It was really great to have this conversation about educational things, you know, issues in education, but speaking about it in the context of a completely different culture, right? And I felt that journey was fascinating, and I think you'll enjoy it. So welcome to Knowledge Unbound, episode 5. I'll see you at the end. Enjoy. So I am here at the American University in Cairo with today's guest, Dr. Maha Bali. Maha, welcome to Knowledge Unbound.
Thank you. Welcome to Cairo. I love that your podcast has Unbound, like our project that could be Unbound, so it's perfect. I'm so glad you made it to.
I promise you, I didn't steal the name from you. I promise you that. That was independently came up with by my friend. It is something like that. So Maha, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, so I'm Maha Bali. I am a professor of practice at the American University in Cairo in the Center for Learning and Teaching. So my main work is to support other professors in my institution with their teaching. And I also teach an undergraduate course. It's a liberal arts requirement. And it's a digital literacies and intercultural learning course. And then we put AI in it now. We always had AI in it, but now it's in the title. Yeah. And I also do a lot of public scholarship. So Equity Unbound is one of the projects I co-founded with Mia Zamora in the US. And I do a lot of open work as well.
Okay. What's the relationship between, I'm pretty sure that Equity Unbound, which I know I've presented with, encompasses open, but it's more than that. So if you had to kind of just describe to people what Equity Unbound is, what its goals are, why we should care about it.
Yeah. So Equity Unbound is very emergent. We initially started it for. It's quite different than what it does now. It's different than what it did in the pandemic. So it's kind of being responsive to sort of what does the world need that we are uniquely equipped to offer.
Right.
So I'll start from the beginning.
Okay.
So it started out that Mia Zamora and I, when we teach our courses, we try sometimes to get our students to do things together.
Okay.
And then one time we were like, maybe we should open up the kinds of activities we're doing with our students and not make it just one time, make it longer, make it several times throughout the semester. And they're like, well, maybe other people can join too. Because in my class, my students do intercultural experiences that are quite structured. But I'm like, you know, what I learn from interacting with other people in the open, whether collaborative annotation or at the time doing like Twitter activities and meeting other people from all over the world, I want students to be exposed to that. And it's a bit digital literacy too. Like, can you learn with other people in a way that isn't necessarily classroom based?
Mm-hmm. So the idea, this was focusing at least initially on classroom design. Okay.
So at the time when we defined Equity Unbound, we said it's an open, connected, intercultural, equity-focused, open, connected, intercultural learning curriculum. And we would design some activities together that one or both of us were doing in our classes. We also had Catherine Cronin at the time from Ireland. But then at some point she left academia, so then she didn't have a class. But in the beginning, she was also part of it and her students were part of it. But then we'd open it up and then other friends of ours from all over the world who are teaching something similar to the topics we were teaching would jump in for certain activities and jump out. So we were doing activities related to equity and bias and just generally thinking about identity.
Yeah.
And we would share the kinds of videos we were watching, the readings we had, do an activity together. Let's annotate this reading together and invite others from all over the world to join. And then over several semesters, and then we would bring in a guest look to like a studio visit and who would talk about like fake news or talk about oppression and algorithms or things like that. And we would invite other people to join in. What eventually started happening is that we started to realize that the people who were benefiting the most from all of this were the teachers who were co-designing together and supporting each other. And like the students were in it fine, but you were helping each other out a lot. And so it was good for our well-being. Then the pandemic happened.
So before you move on to the pandemic, because I'm curious, it sounds like you taught this class. Is it only in American university context, at least when it was designed?
My class, the one I'm teaching right now?
Not right now, but at least the beginning, Equity Unbound, when that began, you were teaching this class at AUC, sorry.
Something else. And Mia is teaching a completely different course, but there was some intersecting outcome.
Okay. So the thing I want to get at, which I think would be very interesting, is if you're teaching this class and you came up with this way to collaborate with somebody in the US and Ireland, etc., but then given the topics that you're raising up, like data algorithms, implicit bias, I can imagine those things would unfold a little bit differently in the different cultures. What was that cross collaboration / cross conversation like, talking about those things in fairly unique contexts?
Right. And so this is why talking about identity is useful too in the beginning. So you know who are my students, where are they coming from? Or these other students, where are they coming from? So they know that they're talking with people from different cultures. So then when we come and talk about these things, sometimes that comes up a lot. Like culturally, what's going on here? We do something called an alternative CV, where you present yourself not with a regular CV, but what you're proud of in yourself. And they would share that with students in other countries. And then they would get to know them. And before they start talking, about this. In other semesters, we had someone coming in from Italy. We had something from Canada, But yes, like things like that happen. So I'll tell you with the pandemic, because this will help a little bit with what you just say. So with the pandemic, what happened was like, oh my God, what is happening here? We need to continue. If we're going to continue working online during the pandemic, we need to do it with care. So we started crowdsourcing from people all over the world resources on how we're going to do this. And we have a group of people that we invited in a Twitter DM. It was intended for one session, and we're still in a group together now, but to Signal. People from all over the world are like, how are we dealing with this? And so especially the ones from South Africa and the ones from Egypt, we benefited a lot from each other because we have a more similar context in terms of connectivity of internet, for example. And then one time we had a session with our students, mine, Mia's, and Kate Bowles in Australia. We found a time that all of our students could get together and share the experience of how is your well-being during the pandemic, for example. And it was especially about, how is it in different cultures?
What are some of the things you learned from the Egypt-South African context to that specific question?
Yeah, that specific question was, I think, one of the best things that the University of Cape Town, when they came out with their guidelines for faculty about dealing with this, about having alternatives to synchronous things in case someone's connectivity wasn't great. That was one of the things we were thinking about as well. We have the opposite problem, is that we were originally asking faculty members to do asynchronous stuff because we were worried about the connectivity, but they wanted synchronous because they didn't have enough time to design asynchronous, which made a lot of sense. So one of the things we were like, how can you design something so it can be done this way or that way in case a student can't make it, for example? But actually, Egypt upped their connectivity, so their activity turned out to be better. But still, people in different parts of Egypt, even in affluent parts of Egypt, sometimes don't have great connectivity. And so those are things that are very different than... And I know in the US, there are areas that have lower connectivity, same with Canada, for example. But definitely in the South African and Egyptian context, these things come to mind right away. They had some really interesting things in South Africa where the government would make the internet free, the 4G free at a certain time. I can't remember if it was 3G or 4G at the time. And we couldn't do that for the whole country, but we did do something in my institution where students who were on scholarships, we made sure that they had internet.
Right.
Because suddenly you start to see these qualities that are kind of transparent when they're living on campus of the dorms where they get access to all that. So those were the kinds of things that I thought being our culture.
What was the origin of it? So I know you talked about the class, right? But the name choice is very deliberate.
Yeah.
This could have just been interdisciplinary ideas for non-majors or something, right? What was the origin of the name choice, and why was that especially the equity piece, right? Why was that so important to you?
One of the interesting things about, because I know you have a book also with Equity Mind. Equity actually means social justice, not just equity. The other thing about equity versus equality, like people who work very deeply in the field of social justice are very strong about its equity and opportunity. I think that's maybe why we chose that word. I think Mia and I, and Catherine as well, in general, in our work in the open, we met through online open courses, right? And we didn't meet face-to-face until like the year before. We just created Equian a few months before.
Online open courses that you took or gave?
Both.
Okay.
Actually. Yeah. So there was one that Mia was co-designing, and then it was with Howard Reingold and a few other people, and then it was a very active learner, so they made me one of the facilitators, and then we gave other things together. The Unbound is also important because we're thinking like open, so Unbound, because there are boundaries. And we actually cite Nina Moser, who's a Lebanese writer, and we cite her for saying the only way to make borders meaningless is to keep insisting on crossing them. And that's what we want. We want to cross these boundaries between our institutions, between our countries, and open that up, but in an equitable way. Today we were in sessions that you were facilitating, and some of the conversations happening in our small group was about a very common thing.
Right.
Bring in people and let's have diversity, but then there's nothing that we're changing about the way we're doing things to make this diversity work and to support people who come from different backgrounds and levels of preparation, and interests and motivations, all of that. So the equity piece was so important. It's not just about opening things. The internet is not an equitable space just because it's open.
Yeah.
So we were very cognizant of that kind of thing. And before Equity Unbound, there's a lot more we've done in Equity Unbound that I need to tell you, but before Equity Unbound, I had co-founded something called Virtually Connecting. And Virtually Connecting started out in that my child was young and I'm here in Egypt and I wanted to go to these conferences in the US where I was in the organizing committee and things like that. And I couldn't travel and take her with me because someone take care of her or something. And
what, a 2-year-old can't sit through 4 talks at a...
And it's not difficult to do your presentations online or to attend presentations online. What I was missing was the social hallway conversations that people were having. And I had so many friends that I met online that I didn't have a chance to meet. So one of my friends was going to that conference and said, well, I can connect you through my phone or my iPad or whatever, and people can come talk to you. I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm on the virtual committee for that conference. Let's invite other people to join us. So we used at the time Google Hangouts on Air. So that's the precursor to Zoom and Google Meet. And we would just tell people, oh, we're talking to this keynote speaker at this conference. Do you want to join? And then we were like, it doesn't even always have to be a keynote speaker. Just anyone who's attending the conference could share what's happening in the conference. And other people would join and we'd have these conversations. And they're hybrid conversations. Before, people were really talking about hybridity. Here at the conference, other people are virtual. We started to develop what we're calling intentionally equitable hospitality. And Mia was part of that as well. She was our US leaders. We started to grow a lot and do a lot of conferences. And it started to be like, oh, who are the people who aren't at the conference? Whose voices are missing? The people from the global south, like me, a lot of mothers with young children, or single parents who can't just leave their kids anywhere. Contingent faculty who don't have funding, early career people who don't have funding or can't travel. And also what we started to realize was it wasn't just about the traveling and whatever. It was also about, even if you're an early career person who has funding, would you be able to go up to the keynote speaker and have a conversation with them?
Right.
So we were doing these hallway type conversations with people. People didn't have access to talk to someone like Brian News.
Who thinks I'm the keynote? I could just be like sitting in the crowd like everyone's.
So this intentionally equitable hospitality that originally developed for these kinds of spaces was all about how do you make sure that even though there are some people in a space sitting together and others joining virtually who have less power, how can you make sure it's an equitable conversation?
Yeah.
So then when the pandemic happened and everything was online, we didn't have the face-to-face versus online. Everybody was online. But you realize, actually, yes, when you're facilitating an online conversation, there's a lot of hospitality that needs to happen to make people feel welcome. And the other things that happened that Equity Unbound went into were, first of all, people didn't know going into like September 2020, how were they going to build community in a class when they'd never met their students before? Now, all of us who've been teaching and learning online beforehand knew how to do that, but it was different because people came to our classes. They were usually graduate students. They weren't undergrads. They weren't young kids, right? Learning online, not as much. So we developed this site. We collaborated with 1HE in the UK. And we're like, okay, here's some activities you can do to build community online, and we're going to act them up for you. And we're jam together. So this is what I'm going to do in my class, and me as my student. And
So this is virtually reconnecting was doing that, or Equity Unbound? Okay, go on. Yeah.
with Flint.
Yeah.
But we did it with essentially equitable hospitality, which we developed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one informs the other, right?
So we'd invite anyone we know who wants to suggest an activity, and we just film it with them. And so, for example, there'd be an activity where someone says, open your camera and show me where you are. And then right in that session, we had someone from Kenya who said, well, my connectivity is not great, so I can't open my cameras. Here's what I'll do instead. And someone says, oh, my room is a bit messy. Or someone say, oh, child is right behind me. I don't want to show up on the camera. So you'd show live.
Right.
This activity needs to be adapted in the moment, and that's part of intentionally approval.
Right.
You need to be adaptable. You need to anticipate that these things could happen,
Mm-hmm.
which is why in this video we're showing you so that you can anticipate what could happen in your classes. And so you can imagine we did like warm-up activities, introductory activities, ways to engage students throughout the semester. And we'd give adaptations if you don't have, like we'd explain underneath, if you don't have Zoom and you don't have breakout rooms, you can do it this way. If you have to do it asynchronously, here's a way to do it. Here's a template. And this, to me, was also a show of equity in the sense that how can you support the whole world? Because every educational developer who had the same role that I do was burnt out because we were supporting the entire institution. You were used to supporting like 10%. And then some institutions don't even have centers for learning and teaching. Some have one person handling the entire center. So that was another thing we did. After the murder of George Floyd, we started something called Socially Just Academia. Started with like inclusive citation, but then we got together with several educators of color originating from different parts of Africa and Asia, and we and myself and several African Americans here at AUC, and we got together and thinking about like what can we do so that at least our institutions are resisting racism, discrimination. And then the last thing we did is mid-year festival. So I can talk about that, or I feel like I've been talking to.
Oh, no. I came all the way to Egypt. So you're going to talk a lot. This is just different, man. It's just different. Yeah. So sorry, you're talking about my fest.
So My Fest is mid-year festival. Reason it's called mid-year festival is that a group of us from different parts of the world. So with Equity Unbound, Mia and I are constant, and then the other collaborators have changed over time.
Okay.
So with Socially Just Academia, they were other educators of color necessarily, like had to be someone of color to be able to understand why we were focusing on this thing. With the 1HE community building resources, it was anyone who builds community in their class, and we learned from them, and we put up the resources and organized. With this one, it was a group of us who were starting to get frustrated with, in 2022, the online conferences were still happening, but the face-to-face life was coming back.
Right.
And nobody wanted to sit on Zoom all day to attend the conference. So
Right.
it was Zoom fatigue. And also people didn't want to have to choose between parallel sessions in a conference. It was exhausting.
Right.
Choice was exhausting. So we're like, wait a minute. Why can't, if we're not going to travel, right? Why does a conference have to be 3 days if it's online? Why don't we have it spread out over 3 months? Why do we have to have 100 sessions a day? We could just have 2 sessions a day, 3 sessions a day spread out throughout the 3 months. And then people can come in and out of whatever topics they wanted. Were there enough conferences out there talking about the kind of things we cared about related to social justice, critical pedagogy, and open education, and a little bit of digital literacy? It was just a combination of us who were trying to make that work. And one of us was from South Africa. So the naming mid-year festival, because it's not summer in the Southern Hemisphere. And then, and the acronym becomes MY, and it's because choose your own learning journey. Well, that's what my book does. And when you and Karen Cangelosi gave a STEM group of sessions about STEM to track like 3 sessions, I think. And that was social justice and STEM, right? Open in STEM. So we were choosing people that we knew would give things with an equity-minded approach and would facilitate with an equity-minded approach. And we had community building sessions, and this is the 3rd. We've run it 3 times now. Years.
Let me get back to definitions for a second, right? And I love how intentional you are about why you chose equity and being very clear to us as to the relationship between equity and social justice and the degree to which social justice informed the choice of the word equity.
Yeah.
As you know, we, in some parts of the world, well, namely the US, even epistemology is now politicized to a point where, I mean, I won't get into the details, right? But, just to put it mildly, it's just kind of sad to see where we've gotten so quickly, right? I know that's not the case where you are here in AUC, but I just want maybe to hear from you a little bit about, even if you were to take the politics out of it, what you've seen out there in terms of misuse of the word, careless use of the word, and again, like taking the political aspect out of it. But I kind of always felt that I've seen a sliding scale, right? I've seen it kind of thrown into things where it had a buzzword feel to it, and it was not sort of very clear, and I couldn't draw a line between your use of the word and what I'm seeing happening. But I know with you, there's just so much intentionality. Like, what has been your experience in seeing it used, and then your own journey towards your own use of it?
I love this question. My mind's going in a lot of directions. First of all, because there's a paper coming out by Mia and I where we talk about authenticity in socially just care.
Okay.
But stepping back, we also have, Mia and I developed something that we actually developed for Open Ed 2020 keynote. And it's called the Equity Care Matrix. And what we were talking about is what is equity without care and what is care without equity. So care without equity results in like effective labor because very few people are doing care, but it's not equitably distributed.
Right.
It's selective because some people don't get cared about. But the one you're talking about, I think, is the equity without care. It's what we're calling contractual equity. It's like checkbox exercise. We're supposed to be 5 days. Performative, it's diversity theater. We're doing what makes us look good. Right. We're not doing it with care. We haven't internalized the values behind it. So it's not really socially just care.
Right.
And for it to be socially just care requires a lot of different dimensions. And one of them is the people who are going to get cared about need to have a say in how they want to be cared about. Everybody needs to be cared about, and everybody needs to contribute to caring, not just some people and others not. Even though we know, for example, when we were listening to your talk today, sitting next to me was the director of accessibility at AMC.
Mm-hmm.
We have recently gotten scholarships to bring in more students with disabilities into the university. That's adding diversity, right? But we have not gotten funding to increase the size of our center so that we have our numerous to support these people. We don't necessarily have funding. We have funding to cover their fees, but not the equipment they need to be able to succeed in university. So this looks like, oh, look at this university that's bringing in more students. And then asking all the professors to do it without giving them time to learn how do you teach people with these different disabilities when you have multiple different disabilities in your class. Every teacher not only needs to be able to teach, needs to be able to have the equity mindedness to care that you have to adapt to these different people in the first place, in the way you design your class as an anticipatory accountability that I know that students might be different. But then there's also a little bit of a 10-20% that you'd have to do for each individual student as a special case.
Right.
And so with intentionally equitable hospitality, we say sometimes someone can be unintentionally inequitable because they don't realize that someone has a hidden disability, for instance.
And that you're not demonizing the person.
Yeah, you're not the person. Not there's someone who is unintentionally equitable because they're just trying to engage their students and it just turns out that it works. Then there are people who are intentionally inequitable, but I'm still not demonizer. So the intentionally inequitable person knows they have a student with a disability, but they're still not doing what they need to do. It's either when you dig deeper, it's either they don't know what they're supposed to do. They don't think it's their job. They think it's someone else's job. They don't have the time to do it. There was one professor, and I have this story, and she's someone who cares about social justice, but she got a student with a disability. She's like, oh, I don't know what to do. What am I going to do with this? If you have a student who has a visual impairment and it's a class where you have to do video filming, no idea how that gets done. But then as soon as we figured out what was going on and we sort of created a small ecosystem of different people who can support the student and where she needs to step in and where the student needs to step in, it worked out fine. And she was very happy and the student was happy. But these systems need to be in place. When the systems aren't in place to support someone who does care, then you'll get the checkboxing and the actual things happening on the ground aren't being supported.
Right.
So
that's the matrix, right? That you just described.
Yeah.
It sounds like a quadrant.
It's got 4 quadrants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
One that I didn't talk about is systemic injustice.
Okay.
Neither equity nor care.
Right. Let me drill on the intentionally inequitable quadrant for a second. And then I take the same vein as you, not demonizing, but I think about some of these really tricky situations, and I think even people who believe in social justice, who want to do the right thing, it's it's a weird space to be in depending on what the particular inequity is. And let me give you a specific example. Colleague in a country that's mostly Muslim, right? And at her particular institution, there's a small percentage of LGBTQ identified students, right? She's in a large class, and she does what she thinks is right to make them feel like they belong, in terms of don't treat them any differently, and But some of the more conservative students in the class actually don't like that, because to them, her doing that is a indicator that she supports that. Right. Now, of course, where I grew up in Trinidad is relatively conservative. So there was some of that when I was younger. I don't think to that extent, because it's not a monolithically religious country. Of course, the U.S. is a lot more to the left in terms of its acceptance. So I haven't had the experience of being in that environment for an extended period of my professional life. Right. And so, okay, now you're looking at this from the outside. Do you get mad at the students for feeling that way? Because
what you're describing has happened to me.
Okay, because you feel like, as somebody who's progressive in their values, you feel like,
So people listening to
right.
this podcast don't know this.
Right.
So clearly, I'm Muslim to some extent. They Muslim by name, hopefully. So this happens to me a lot. I get very conservative students want to talk about LGBTQ issues as an equity issue.
Right.
And I had a student, especially this semester. So this is one of those things that goes up and down in Egypt and at AUC, especially. AUC is on the more liberal side for Egypt. There are still conservative students. And what I try to explain to a student, so first of all, whenever we're talking about social justice, there's power differences of dynamics within a classroom. So there are different types of power, gender and race and social class and ability and neurodiversity and all of that. So there isn't like one person who's definitely the most powerful and one person who's definitely the least powerful. It's intersectional and it's called this. So when this person comes and tells me, well, I'm feeling uncomfortable with this reading that talks about so-and-so. And I say, do you agree that these are people who are generally oppressed in a lot of countries?
Uh-huh.
Are they treated as less than human sometimes? Or are their rights sometimes not given to them? It's not about whether you agree with them religiously or not. That's not for you to say. I mean, that's not what I'm saying either.
Right.
I'm not telling you to change your beliefs. I'm saying your beliefs should not influence the way you treat the people. And I tell her, imagine you, and she was actually someone who covers her face as well. Something that probably doesn't get treated well, like in France.
Right. So there might be laws now against it in some parts of it, right?
Yeah. So being oppressed when you put yourself, this empathy is difficult because you can't walk in someone's shoes. You can try to put yourself, but you have your own history and your own beliefs and your own worldview. And you're trying to, in the course of a very short amount of time, tell someone try to think differently. It's really hard. Yeah, I think it really made a huge difference to when I lived in the U.S. for a year, and then I lived in England for a year. When I lived in the U.S., I lived in Houston, and it was just before Obama got elected, and it was fine. But when I lived in the UK, I lived somewhere where everybody was white. When I wear a wool cap in the winter, people treated me normally. And then when they saw me with a headscarf, they stopped talking to me. I could see that.
Like I'm the same person.
It was just there.
A month ago, temperature just went up. That's all I'd say.
Yeah, so I could see that. I could see people just totally shy away from speaking to me at all or look at me weird and talking about me. So I got to experience being a minority. And I think everyone needs to experience what that is to feel it, to really know. And different minorities get treated in different ways. It's not like I know what it means to be a black man in America, for example.
Would you like me to tell you? Well, okay, this is what actually has me so interested, back to the question I asked you about your class and, the students from different countries. Because here's the thing. You're right? Empathy is hard. It would be nice if people are able to have different experiences or at the very least understand how people who don't look like them or have a different lived history live through their own past, right? But in reality, I don't think that's going to describe most people, right? Now, fortunately, we live in a world that's a little bit cheaper to travel. There's a little bit more opportunity to get new places to have that experience. But as a professor, I feel like by and large, people kind of know what they know. And so now that then leaves people like us to say, okay, well, how do we create that? Through our petition.
You can travel. ever have intercultural.
Oh, absolutely, right? There's a Hilton everywhere.
And so, my students also do these intercultural learning experiences outside of Equity Unbound, something called Solea, and they talk specifically about cultural issues with a facilitator to help talk about these. And what will happen is these topics will come up and someone will say something offensive because they don't realize it's offensive. Because that's what you are when you're not very culturally astute. You don't even realize that what you're saying is offensive, and you won't know how to talk about it. I think young people need safe spaces to make those mistakes. And students make these mistakes in my class a lot, and they say very inappropriate things about other cultures. And there may be people in the room who do belong to that kind of minority group, and they don't realize. And it doesn't matter if they're here or not, but this is a space to talk bravely about these things in order to open up. But you need a lot of time to get there. I think the issue is when someone isn't very young, and it's much harder to change their mind.
Right. I could give you a couple examples of that. But I'm glad to hear you put it that way, because one of my critiques of even people who do social justice work sometimes is they turn it away from it being education and more towards an orthodoxy where there's no space given for those mistakes to be made. And so I'm like, well, they had to learn somehow. I mean, and if this was never part of the experience, I'm not saying the statement in and of itself is okay. Mm-hmm. I'm saying, like, let's keep our eyes on the goal. The goal is for people to develop that competence. And there's a journey towards that, right? And so let's nurture and facilitate and be able to listen and understand from whence it came versus just have this checkbox of rules. If you don't follow it, you're off the island.
And so two things related to this. First of all, even if you're the most socially just-minded person, every time you encounter culture you are not familiar with, there are some stereotypes you have about that culture or something wrong that you don't know that culture. So that's very important. The other element related to what you're saying is a calling in versus a calling out. Right. And it's a very thin line. And I think I was much more abrasive when I was younger to call out. That's not helpful because that brings up resistance, right? Okay, you call someone out, they get upset, you're offending. How could you? There's a very nice video by Jay Smooth, how to tell someone they're racist. And he says, you never tell them they're racist. Tell them that thing you did is racist. Start doing this thing. Right. You're not saying use their behaviors that can. Jay will bring up all the ways in which they aren't racist. Oh, I have a black friend or whatever. But I'm telling you, this joke is racist, right? It's about pointing out those particular things. The other element, so this calling in is to say, I know you mean well, or I know you care about your students. I know we all care about our students, but maybe you didn't realize that this is a thing that might upset students who are X, right? So there's that. And then there's the multidimensionality of injustice, and also the systemic and the interpersonal and the intrapersonal, like, and the internalized, like to recognize that there are some women especially grow up in a culture where they're not. Today, people were talking about, why don't we have a lot of female engineers in our classes? There's a lot of stuff going on here. There's women who wouldn't apply because they've brought up to believe they can't be.
I was thinking, like, which answer should I go with to that question?
I myself, I'm a computer scientist. I worked in the IT department of a multinational company for 2 years. First of all, I don't like computer science for other reasons, because I like people. But the main reason I couldn't stand it at all is just people just assume that men know computers better than women. It just drives me crazy. It's just a cultural thing. And my colleagues are listening to this. We record this right now. But it's just, this is very frustrating because I was a very good student. I was a 3.98 student. I know my computer science. I just, okay, fine. You're not going to give me I'm going somewhere else. Yeah. And then I get into ed tech, and that still got the man's grade.
That was his only. Well, actually, I'll tell you a quick funny story about ed tech before I ask my next question. One of my former grad students and I wrote a chapter for an edited book in ed tech. And the editors came out of England. And they reached out to me because of some of the other stuff I had written. And so I said, hey, Cynthia, this sounds like a good project. And it was interesting going through the editing process because basically the crux of our essay was, don't let the tail wag the dog, right? Like, education is a human business, and then figure out what kind of environment you want, and then figure out what tech you need to support that. And here's all the reasons why you should do that. We bring up implicit bias, et cetera, right? And so there was some stuff in there about percentages of women and why that is. what we have known from computer science education research about how women are sometimes chilly climates, right, basically. And the editor was a nice guy, so I'm really not trying to like shame him here, but I remember he had written back and he said he didn't quite understand the critique, and he went and he asked all of his female colleagues, oh God. I just could imagine them looking at it, oh my, are these words coming out of your mouth right now? But to be fair, this is back to our point. If you're going to learn, right, hopefully some grace was given. And I think, to be fair to him, that the point was made. Okay, let me circle back to something you sort of said a little bit off the side, but I want to drill in. You said, you were much more abrasive when you were younger, which suggests to me that there was some fairly heightened awareness of social justice issues, not simply in the last 5 years of Equity Unbound or whatever. And I'm curious to hear about your journey to that space, like even at the time when you perhaps considered yourself more abrasive, like how did Maha end up in that space, and what was that sort of evolution of your own work like?
That's so interesting. And I'm not 100% sure how it happened. I'm going to think through the things that have happened to me that I think might have helped. So first of all, I got into thinking about, I think all women notice gender discrimination pretty early on. Most of our societies are like that. So I remember being a child who noticed that. So that is a thing but then the awareness about the other kinds of discrimination through lived experiences and being minority in some places and some others. But the other things that have happened is the revolution in Egypt in 2011.
Okay.
My PhD thesis was about studying the development of critical thinking, and I came across critical pedagogy along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I realized is that even though Egyptian schools don't teach critical thinking, they actually go against questioning authority and so on, people still manage to develop a little bit of that because of the internet and international media, and they were able to revolt. Do you know what they weren't able to do? They were able to oust the regime, but they weren't able to rebuild. You were able to constructively create something together because they were able to say no. They were able to say what they didn't like, and they were able to debate, but they weren't able to dialogue and construct something together despite their differences.
Right.
They knew what they didn't want, but they didn't know how to get everything they want together. And I felt like there was a feminist way of working together that they didn't have. And therefore, it was like what Paulo Freire talks about in critical pedagogy. You get chaos when you have consciousness raising without
a plan,
collective action plans for praxis, right? So I think that was part of it, is just like realizing. And then, of course, in that time, a lot of Egyptian society was polarized. And then we had an Islamist government, and then that was polarizing. And then ousting that government was another level of polarizing, so that the Egyptian society was very polarized. And then it became difficult, I think, in the same way that a lot of Republicans and Democrats sometimes can't talk to each other at the same dinner table. This was happening in Egypt as well. So I was realizing that if I just said outright what I wanted to say, that would just cause a lot of harm, and it's not going to reach the other person. So you can't take it that way. You'd have to critique a particular action and explain why that was harmful. And wearing a headscarf, you get taken as supporting a particular ideology, which I didn't, and I never did. And it was very annoying to be stereotyped in those ways. And so I think those things kind of help me think about that. The other one is having a child and realizing that children don't just do what you tell them, but you realize that you have to not make a child feel bad about themselves.
Right.
But help them be a better person without making them feel bad. So that's one. And of course, as an educational developer, in the beginning of my career, I did not have a PhD. And then I had a PhD, and suddenly people respected me, which is very funny when it happens, because same person I was yesterday before, I defended my thesis, but it's okay, now you believe me. But also, because I work with people who may be tenured faculty who have a lot more experience than me, there's also an element of, I can't tell them what to do.
Right.
You have to figure out another way to convince them. And you talked about this today, actually, is like, who's the person in front of you? What perspective are they coming from? Now, how can you reach them to help them think through the things you want them to think through and reach their own conclusion? I've become much more, the more I teach, the more humble I am about my educational development practice, because, it's about how can I help them achieve what's in their educational philosophy, and not necessarily how can I make them have the same philosophy I have, while at the same time trying to reduce harm to students as well from some harmful educational philosophies, right? And so all of that comes from that sort of practice, because if I want educators to be equitable with students and to give them agency, I need to, as much as possible, make sure that how I support them gives a lot of agency.
Yeah.
And it's so much easier to do this outside your institution in the open with something like Mid-Year Festival.
Right.
That is, I have no institutional requirement that someone has to come and they get a certificate for doing it and they won't get promoted or their contract won't be renewed. Like outside of the institutional things, you can try these things. And then if they work, you can try to bring them back into the institution and try to say, well, how can we create institutional environments that make equity easier? Like during the pandemic, when they said, oh, no grades or remove the grades for a term or make it pass-fail for one course, these were equity measures that why don't we do them all the time? People experience trauma all the time. It's not just during the pandemic when everyone's experiencing it to one extent or another. But all the time people are experiencing things, death of a parent, breaking up with a girlfriend, whatever, getting sick, all kinds of things.
Why isn't it always in your radar? At least in terms of civil discourse, since 2011, like how would you describe things now? Just like in terms of the society and people, factions, all of that stuff. Clearly right now it's not the same as 2011. I don't imagine it to be perfect, but how would you describe how things are now?
It changes all the time. Yeah, like what it is, and like this year was different. What's happening with Palestine, Israel changed, something that we all have in common to an extent. So stop talking about some other things, but there are all kinds of issues. So as much as I'm talking about calling in, I try not to get into any political conversations because I'm going to get anywhere. And I try to just focus on what I can control and what I can influence in the area of education. That's a lot of weird stuff happening with education too. I try not to get into that because it's not...
It goes nowhere. Well, the reason why I ask is because, a colleague of mine recently described the U.S. as having 4 political parties, which I thought was a pretty prescient way of describing what's happening now, right? So 2 kind of main parties, but in each party there's sort of extreme wings of each, which might be true of all over the world, but I feel like the last sort of 5-7 years is a lot of heels being dug in, making it very difficult to do anything productive when you're on either side of the camp, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm asking you this because I know I wouldn't necessarily call what we're happening now quite 2011 in Egypt, but I do, as an academic, right, I do wonder if there are lessons to be learned where is this a little bit of a fork in the road moment where we see what could happen if this heel digging continues and we can't figure something out, so we yield to one of the extreme elements, or is there something, I dare say, as institutions of higher education, that we can and should be doing differently in our classrooms, on our campuses, and honestly, I know you're a public scholar, like how we communicate our message of love and peace and critical discourse to the public. Is there a role that we need to be playing to be putting some guardrails on this, right? And that's his whole conversation about higher ed and the public in the U.S., but as you brought that up, it just made me think about it. And I imagine that, again, this is not 2011. There had to be some healing that took place, at least a little bit. And I wonder if in that healing process, there were some lessons learned.
I don't know what happened in the other institutions. Definitely at AUC, you could have in the same classroom people who are on.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think, there is something to be said for learning to listen to the point of view of the other, learn to try to understand why they think that way, and still respectfully sharing your views and finding common ground on certain things and figure what the differences are. It's very difficult when something has a background of violence. So it's not easy. It's so much harder to say, let's come and sit. All right, who has power at which points? I do think there's also something important that Martha Nussbaum calls combined capabilities. TSN has the capability theory, right? She talks about combined capability. One of the things I think sometimes we don't do in higher education is we give someone a capability, but the combined capability depends on the context, depends on their ability to apply that. I think there's something in biology related to DNA and the genes you have and whether they actually...
Got it, yeah. So they're there, but you need to open the histones to express them. Yeah, right.
So what happens, I think, with a place like AUC that helps with dialogue and freedom of expression and things like that is that you do it. They go out into a kind of political environment where that's actually quite dangerous and you can get into controversies and things. And so what I think we forget to do sometimes is to also let them know that this is what's out there and how could this be used constructively if the environment you're in is like that. So if you just go and work in a multinational company in corporate, that's not a problem. But what if your goals are larger than that? I think the thing that higher ed needs to do is, yes, train people to have constructive conversations, give them a lot of experiences of having constructive conversations about things they truly care about and they're passionate about in a safe environment. Help them get better at this. Help them get better at listening to offensive things and being able to absorb them and still be able to respond. When I was doing my PhD, one of the professors I was interviewing was saying, a political science and law professor, anger is good. Anger is not a bad thing. Anger is a good thing. I think we're taught that anger is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Anger is good. You just need to learn how to channel it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did notice that when I'm angry or very passionate and I speak in a particular way, nobody responds. But when I calm myself down a little bit, and I hate that because sometimes I need to urgently yell.
Yeah, right. You want to write to me.
But
yeah.
Speak a little bit more calmly. People listen better. Unfortunately, it's unfair. I think it's unfair. But those are things that we need to learn to do. But the thing that I think is missing from higher ed is like, how do you then enact all of this in environments that are hostile to this way of doing things, where not everybody else around you is being trained to behave this way, and so you're gonna go and people are gonna respond to you differently.
Right.
So how are you gonna do that? How are you gonna do it safely or bravely? So got to know what the risks are,
right,
and then make the decision of whether this is a risk worth taking or not worth taking.
Yeah, the I don't know if this is the right corollary here, but I think about in the 60s, MLK was all about nonviolence, right? And one of the things that the Black Power movement had said, maybe a little bit inarticulately, I think, is like, dude, they killed you, right? But look what happened, right? And to be fair, some people would say, but, you achieved so much, right? Bills got passed. And so that's a debate for another time. But I guess I've just bring it up to highlight how hard and how tricky it is, right? Because I'm with you, right? I am a bit more of the, I think the way forward is to listen, even if I have to hear things that hurt and all of that stuff. But I want to acknowledge how difficult it is.
And there is something else that's really important that I think I should share here. And it's about allyship taking time to develop. Sometimes you develop in private and sometimes in public. It depends on what's safe. So I know, for example, sometimes in my university, there's something that needs to be said. And I say it in Senate out loud. And then some people will support me right then and there. Right? And there are other people who will text me private to support me.
Yeah.
But of course, it took me a while to be able to feel safe saying these things. And it's because in my department, I feel safe. So I know that if I say it, someone's going to protect me from my department. But if someone's not in that kind of space, it's difficult to speak up. But then hearing someone else say it helps. And then you can have your own private conversations with those other people who can't at the moment speak publicly about those things. I think in the U.S. right now, a lot of people who support Palestine are having to do it in a very private manner because it supports someone privately in a safe way that they can help them, right? Because it's a difficult political context.
Yeah. And I'm hearing sort of two things. One is if you are one of those who have some safety, associated with your title, et cetera, there's almost a little bit of responsibility to speak out on behalf of others. But then the other side of it too is, structuring university environment so that you're not disempowering so many people that then academics can't really feel safe, except for sort of a chosen few. Tell me a little bit about your public scholarship. So I know you have a blog which we'll include on the website when this is published. What are the things you write about? What sort of inspired the desire to do that? What kind of experiences you've had doing it?
Yeah. Okay, thanks for asking how it started. So it started because of two reasons. One of them is when you're writing your PhD and someone keeps telling you you have to write in a formal way, but you don't want to write that. So I wanted to and I was experiencing this, finishing my PhD, and I have a lot of thoughts I want to share. And I was sending really long emails to my our group, my department's group, and it was overwhelming everybody. Nobody else was I had like 2 academics on the group, and everybody else doesn't really want to talk about all this. It's like overwhelming everyone. And I was publishing in some trade journal magazines, but then you have to go through editing, and it's nice. I learned a lot from editing process, but I had more to say on a daily basis and a thing. So that's why I started my blog. I write mostly about education, but I also started to write things about parenting because parenting is so relevant to education. Every now and then I'll write about other things, but for the most part, there was one recent one about crochet. My daughter wanted to crochet, so we both learned together, but I was connecting it to AI.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because in crochet, if you do something wrong, you have to frog it, which is untangle it and go back, start over.
Okay, that sounds hot.
But yeah, it's very frustrating. But that's also part of the learning process. AI fast tracks this for you, and you never have to, try again and redo it. Then you never struggle. Then you don't learn. Something gets lost. So what are the things that we need to learn to do? So that was the connection. Sometimes I connect tennis to education because I like tennis. I make connections. That's a lot.
I did read the post on AI. Now that you bring it up, and I remember you talking up. Well, I don't want to speak for you, but how should I put this? I know you have very mixed feelings, to put it kindly, about AI and the discussion around AI. Let's go there just for a little bit because, I'm not, you're a computer engineer. I'm not, trained as a biologist. But even before AI became a thing, so I'm talking like even from the get-go, when I started at faculty at 2014, like I just observed this relationship between edtech and higher ed, which was very interesting. And higher ed, I mean, this is the US again, but it was almost as though they had no agency. They just sort of had these people come into the room and basically tell you what you need and then tell you, tell you the problem you have and tell you, obviously, the thing that they made that will solve the problem that they just told you had. You didn't think you had it. You actually probably don't have it, but, they stand to get $50,000, right? And just the spinelessness around it. So again, I'm not a Luddite, like I use tech. I get it, right? I see its role in the universe, but I just worry a little bit about, do we need to be more engaged in the conversation about where it fits, when it matters, when it's appropriate, what kind of checks and balances and guardrails need to be around, not just AI, tech in general. How has been your engagement with that?
Yeah. So this was one of the issues I was having. Is I was working at this center supporting people with using technology in their teaching, and I was learning about critical pedagogy and why are we doing this? Like, where's the thoughtfulness behind the choices we're making, and what's the hidden curriculum of when you do this? Like learning management systems. Oh my God, who manages learning? Why are we managing learning in the first place? And why is everybody going to put their things and turns in over why suspecting students? And if they are ridiculous, they don't know how to do citation and referencing properly. That's not the way to go about it. There are so many things that I have felt like were contradicting my values. And so I believe actually we need to go back to our values every time and our purpose before we ever integrate technology. And I know, so I wrote another article that you may have not seen on LSE, London School of Economics higher blog, because I'm a fellow there. So I was writing about 6 questions to ask ourselves before we adopt any technology in our teaching. And the first one is, what's my teaching philosophy? What are my values? How does this fit in with this? And then always, what is it exactly that it's going to help you with? Can I try first to see if it's going to work, or isn't just what they're promising? Because most of the things they promise don't actually.
Don't let it tell you what you don't.
And the agency, how much agency do I and my students have? Because sometimes your institution forces you to do certain things. Some people who teach multi-section courses have used the same software writer. We have no idea who's making those deals with those companies without talking to the educators. Because most of the time, nobody's talking to the educators. So that's very problematic. But can you still resist? Can you object? Can you just choose not to use it? Right? Or can you let them put your course on this learning management system but not use it yourself, not put anything? So these are important questions. But I think also people forget to ask who might be harmed, who might be marginalized. Are there certain groups? Because not everybody, but maybe certain groups could be harmed.
At least ask the question.
If it's going to be bad for equity, if it's going to be bad for learning, why is anybody doing it? If it's going to be good for learning but bad for equity, what can we do to redress? If it's going to be, a lot of it is actually proven to be good for learning. A lot of educational technology isn't. Some is, but some isn't, or the way you use it, because also it's not just enough. I hear someone was telling me today about this study that was very quantitative about things that help learning. I'm like, yes, but what does it look like on the ground? Like you can't, some details. Online discussions are good for learning. No. Online discussions that have good questions, that are organized in a way that nobody dominates the conversation, and then someone facilitates, and so it's so you were talking about the tail and dog and so on. There are people, Tim Fons especially calls it entangled pedagogy, because there's the recognition of this post-digital kind of situation where it's not really, you don't 100% have agency to use it or not to use it. You should have your values in the middle of it, students' values in the middle of it, and to recognize the technology is acting around you, you choose to use it. AI especially is those where,
right.
Okay, the AI exists. This doesn't mean AI has to exist in higher ed. It means the students have access to it. This is true. This is a fact. This is enough. Students have access to it. So as a teacher, I can decide what I'm going to do about it.
Right.
But I can't control the fact that it exists, the fact that it's improving, the fact that it's free to some extent. And I also can't control the fact that some people can afford the paid version, which is better, and some people can't.
Right.
So what do you do, and what do you do in your own class? What do you advocate for your department? And then educators who are contingent, who have this, like, if my students give me a bad student evaluation, I might not be renewed. I just switch, and
all of this power dynamic.
What am I going to do to prevent it, or give students agency to use it or learn it? And I think with this whole AI, I think us as teachers and the learners need to develop the literacy to work with it. But I also understand that everybody's burnt out from COVID and then hybridity. That's this. And what's the new thing you're going to learn? And again, you think you're teaching your subject.
I like the term entangled pedagogy, because implicit in it, and you didn't say this explicitly, but there feels to be a perniciousness about it, in that it kind of looks like pedagogy. It kind of looks like real pedagogy. But because you've entangled all of these elements in it, there's way less agency than it appears, right? And so there's some almost duplicity about it, is that you look like you're doing all these things and bringing in all this tech, but actually, no, the decisions are being made long before you walk into that door. And that almost feels especially much more pernicious than just, like if you just flipped it over to a robot or something. So I'll ask you one more question, get you out of here on this one. Just in the spirit of intercultural competence, many listeners, and I'll say myself included, won't be deeply familiar with the Egypt context in terms of some of these questions of equity and social justice. And so you alluded to some of it in our conversation about 2011 and things like that. But as an everyday academic and as a CTL director, how do those questions play out in this country, at this university? What are some of the biggest challenges that you sort of face and work with faculty on as it pertains to equity and social justice?
So one of the equity issues which we haven't brought up, there's your religious inequities. We have a Christian minority in Egypt, and the oppression differs. So sometimes there are like terrorist attacks against churches, which has not happened in a while, fully. But then there are other things going on. There's a lot of microaggressions. There's things in the educational curriculum sometimes that just sort of erases parts of their roles in history and things like that. This is something I bring up in my classes, and sometimes Christian students are trained not to talk about it, so then we can't go very far. Sometimes they will talk about it, and then it becomes really useful to listen to, like oppression, for example, in sports teams.
Right.
It's like, and I think it's important that that we're aware of these things and we make sure we don't perpetuate them as much as possible.
I just a quick example on that, and obviously you know more about this than me, but my son, I am two big soccer fanatics, and so my younger son's favorite footballer is Mohamed Salah, and he was telling me that when he posted a picture of him and his family in front of a Christmas tree, he started to get all his hate mail because of the Christmas tree. Yeah, just a few weeks ago. I was like, wow, that's pretty intense. I'm sure it's a minority of people, but still, right? And anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
I think this discrimination that happens a lot in Egypt. So I would say people with disabilities definitely don't have an easy path in general in life. And then when they do enter spaces, it's excellent. It's not, the spaces are not equipped properly for that. Gender, for sure. Both in terms of LGBTQ and just women in general. It's not as bad as I think people in the Western media think. It's much worse than it is, but it's still pretty bad in the systems and the laws and some things like that. And the social class, huge thing. And here at AUC, it's a very elite university, but there are also a lot of scholarships too. So here's a class difference. And then the class difference manifests a lot in how well you speak English.
So that becomes a differentiator almost.
Yeah. So all of those things, I think it's just the thing that I think people don't talk about enough is social and cultural capital, perpetuation of that. And just like when you were talking about someone being a first generation student, a college student, so we don't have as much of that necessarily, because possibly people just who don't enter college and their whole family just never enter.
Right.
Just the fact if your father is an engineer and you become an engineer, you have a lot of advantages. You find a job much easier. There's a lot of nepotism. So that's a very strong thing that happens here in Egypt as well. You grow up in a family that reads, you become a reader, and you become a gay person. That kind of thing is very strong.
Okay, makes sense. Well, I just want to thank you for inviting me to come out here to Cairo for this trip. In fact, I've only been here for like 24 hours so far, but tomorrow I'm going to see the pyramids and the Egyptian Museum. So I'm just really grateful, and thanks for taking some time to talk to us.
Joy, thank you so much for having me.
It was my pleasure.
Being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for a Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Our guest today, Dr. Maha Bali, professor at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. Thanks for joining us. Our producer, Mr. Segev Amasai. Segev.
I do realize there were quite a few things that were unbound, not just in this episode, but in the previous episode of last season.
We'll focus on... Okay. Let me ask you a question. What was unbound in this one, though? What was the...
Equity unbound.
Oh, right. You know, but the thing is, I guess, I've worked on that project with her. Well, kind of. I was a guest in it. And I guess I was just focused on the equity part. So,
right.
Yeah. So you made a joke and it went completely over my head. But
so for context, for those who haven't listened to season 1, I would highly recommend it. In episode 5, we had guest Adam Bush with College Unbound.
Yeah.
And in this one, we had
awesome.
Equity Unbound with Dr. Maha Bali.
Yeah.
So any further thoughts, Brian?
Well, I mean, it's indicative that these individuals, I'm glad you asked, because sometimes people ask me how I choose my guests, and some of it is just my network, right? I'm privileged and blessed to work with incredible people around the world, but there are some of them, right, who think about the world and think about their practice, think about their campuses in a way that they don't put limits on it. And I think in the same way they chose to use the word unbound in their titles is the same reason why we chose to use ours, right? And that helped make for just great chemistry and how we share and exchange ideas. And I hope people get that. So my only wish for you as you go forth into the week coming is that maybe you think about a little bit about what Unbound can mean for you and your practice and your teaching and your craft and your position, because it's only when we do that we realize the true potential of what education could be. I love you. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week, and be excellent to each other.
Okay, the AI exists. This doesn't mean AI has to exist in higher ed. It means the students have access to it. This is true. This is a fact. This is enough. Students have access to it. So as a teacher, I can decide what I'm going to do about it.
Right.
But I can't control the fact that it exists, the fact that it's improving, the fact that it's free to some extent. And I also can't control the fact that some people can afford the paid version, which is better, and some people can't.
Right.
Even if you're the most socially just-minded person, every time you encounter culture you are not familiar with, there are some stereotypes you have about that culture or something wrong that you don't know that culture. So that's very important. And then there's the multidimensionality of injustice, and also the systemic and the interpersonal and the intrapersonal, and the internalized, like to recognize that there are some women especially grow up in a culture where they're not. Today, people were talking about why don't we have a lot of female engineers in our classes? There's a lot of stuff going on here. There's women who wouldn't apply because they've brought up to believe they can't.